Hello there, Rem619 here, and I'm going to be doing something a little bit different today, which is a review, which for me might seem a little bit weird, because I've almost exclusively been playing the Dark Souls series and making content for Dark Souls 3 since that came out. So when you've been playing one game almost exclusively for 2 years, it's a little hard to then justify doing a review on it, because you're never really complete. Like, if you're finding new things and creating new builds, and you're playing it almost every day, you can't really summarize the whole game in a short little snippet of a video. However, with a game like God of War, which is essentially just one long weekend's play with no real reason to do a second playthrough because nothing really changes other than an artificial difficulty, it's quite easy to therefore gather your thoughts and put it all together into making a review. So I was thinking, seeing as I've just finished this game and I did quite enjoy playing it, I might as well put my thoughts together for a review, because there seem to be too many people who are just biasly praising this as the next cure to cancer, the greatest thing since sliced bread, where although it is a very amazing game with a lot of very good things to offer, and hell, something that I would be willing to just mess around grinding in, say, the Niflheim realm, which is something that serves absolutely no purpose for me because I've already completed all the side challenges before I finish the main game. But the fact that the game is so enjoyable, I still wanted to do that. So let's start by talking about the game's strongest aspect, which is the environment. The environments are absolutely beautiful. The way you transition around the world and move around it, everything feels gorgeous. It all puts together so well, and yes, I know it said it feels gorgeous, but it's really hard to put into words just how beautiful everything really is and the sort of feeling you get from it all, because you look at all the things and you can see how much effort they put into it. Yes, some realms maybe look like a little bit of clones, but that's the additional content. The main world itself feels real, it feels natural, and it feels like you are moving around the world rather than just moving around a few set piece and tunnels. Like, say, with Dark Souls 2, the world just didn't connect. It felt like two completely different areas all just stacked on top of each other. Hell, we all remember the notorious, you go up a lift into the sky and suddenly you're in a volcano. Where was that in the sky? But with God of War, everything is really good. I even enjoyed the big open area, which is the lake, just going around on the boat, talking to the boy about things as you get given little stories, and when you pick up another character who also gives you some exposition as you travel around. It's all done very well. I did enjoy going around doing the little side quests there, which for me, in a game that's essentially one giant fetch quest that's also an escort mission, to then do extra fetch quests is pretty impressive, especially considering the game convinced me to do it. The cinematic storytelling done through the environment really does this game justice. There are certain areas where I was just fighting generic waves of enemies at one point, and the entire environment was a lightning storm on top of a mountain, and it was just beautiful. I really got immersed in these moments. There are some really good little set pieces as well as you move around. I'm not going to give too many spoilers, but there will be spoilers in this review, seeing as I have completed it. But they're like the section with the dragon moving through the mines as it then jumps out, and then you get led to the top of the other side of the mountain where you then have to fight with it. It's all done so well and cinematic. Hell, one of the main boss fights, which we'll go into more of the boss fights later, is you have a lightning storm around you as you're going into it as well, and even then, that's done so beautifully. The whole environment of this game, you can tell that they put a lot of effort into it. It wasn't a quick and easy thing. A lot of games are quite lazy with the environments with blank backgrounds, but they put in a lot of detail. Everything you can see is almost relevant, and they do close it off pretty nicely. It's not like a game where you'll see some interesting stuff in the background you never get to explore it. Nearly everything you see in this game you get to go see and feel and do. Now, one of the slightly weaker aspects, but by no means bad, when I say weaker I mean it's not as good as the environments, is the actual gameplay itself. The gameplay in this is very simplistic, but very beautifully done. If you like your hack and slashes like your Dynasty Warriors or your Ninja Gaidens, or hell, even your Devil May Cries, you're gonna really enjoy this. If you've played the previous God of War games, there's no reason not to play this. It is done very well. The system is essentially a block, heavy attack, light attack, spacing sort of thing. So very simplistic is avoid enemy attack, hit enemy back. Press R1 when you can, watch out for when your opponent has unblockable or undodgeable or uninterruptible attacks. Mostly you can get through this game with just hammering R1 on the easier difficulties. It's not until the harder difficulties that you need to start blocking, parrying and dodging. A lot of the stuff is very telegraphed. There are some very obvious prompts, and I feel like they did this to help newer players. It would be nice if there was an option to turn it off. There might be, I haven't looked, but as far as I'm aware you can't. and that's the reticules. When you see a yellow one, you know that you can't block it, and you see a red one that's going to damage you through a block. So a yellow one you can block, but you're going to get a little bit stunned. A red one is going to hurt you. If you could turn that off, the game would be a lot more difficult. One of the things they do with the difficulty in this game is an artificial difficulty, which I didn't enjoy. I played through the game on the second hardest difficulty, which was Give Me a Challenge. Didn't go for Give Me God of War, because they don't actually up the challenge. It does the thing that I think is the laziest way to increase difficulty in any game, which is you increase the enemy's damage and health and you decrease the player's damage. For me, that's not an extra challenge, that's just making the game more tedious. Now, if when you up the difficulty, the enemies just got more aggressive, they got smarter, they avoided your attacks better, they maybe changed a few of their chains so you couldn't just memorize the same patterns, that would justify playing on higher difficulties to me, because that would give me a legitimate challenge. When the game just decides that, nope, you're going to do less damage, enemies are going to do more damage, it kind of trivializes even putting up the difficulty. It's like, well, what was the point? Because if I just learn to get the enemy combos and timings down, it's going to be no different if I play on the easiest difficulty than if I play on the hardest, just as long as I don't get hit. Especially in a game that's based with gears, this makes the beginning of the game very hard, and the end game relatively easy, because as the gear scales, the higher you get with the gear, the less challenge that the game will present. Say for instance, I fought the Valkyrie Queen about halfway through the game, so my gear was pretty low and she could kill me in 2 or 3 hits. This made her a big challenge, because even with maximum health, dying in 3 hits to a boss that can chain more than 3 hits in a single chain and can do 1 hit that are unblockable that will do over half your health is a big challenge. Then we compare this to the final boss, where I was practically in the same gear but slightly upgraded. He couldn't damage me enough to get through my passive regen, and I had very low passive regen. I had 3 arm pieces of regen and then 2 items that gave me regen on top of that, along with regen that I got from doing cleave attacks, from doing perfect throws, and a few other things, such as my runic attacks. So that meant that I could regen health in combat, and the boss just couldn't do anything. He didn't even get me below 9/10 of my health, and to compare that to the Valkyrie Queen, which was 3-shotting me, it just made the final boss very anticlimactic, especially considering that the boss wasn't that impressive, which is again something for me that kind of lets the game down on the gameplay, which is the boss battles. The boss battles in any God of War are the most memorable thing. It's a boss rush game. The whole point of God of War and the challenge comes from getting to the bosses and having those amazing cinematic boss fights. In God of War, I found myself not really remembering many of the bosses. If you skip all the clone bosses, so all the bosses that are just clones of each other and they're scattered again, because these, to me, they're just tougher mobs, they're not really bosses. There are only really 3 main boss fights. Baldur, who is the first and last boss, the dragon, which was quite enjoyable, and Thor's sons, which was my favourite boss fight of the whole game, because it was the only fight that felt like a God of War boss fight. Whereas Baldur was a good introductory boss at the start of the game. At the end of the game, where you're fighting the exact same dude with the exact same moveset almost, it wasn't that enjoyable. As someone who knows and enjoys Norse mythology, Baldur wasn't exactly someone I was impressed or hyped to fight. He was a mama's boy to me, and again, he's not someone that I was really hyped up to fight. The whole way through the game, characters like Thor and Odin are constantly shoved in your face. You're given their epic deeds. You want to fight them. However, this game is a setup game and you never quite get to that, but we'll cover that more when I talk about the story of this game. When it actually came to the rest of the boss fights, although there were some challenges such as the Valkyries were very challenging, because a single mistake can essentially ruin your run. Don't get me started on how many times I got the bosses down to the final bar, they started spamming an unblockable attack, and then they 2-shot me. And if you didn't have your regeneration runes to revive you, that would be very annoying. To then go back through that was very tedious, but again, it did give a nice challenge. But at the same time, there was me playing on the second hardest difficulty thinking, well, if they kill me in 3 hits in this difficulty, and it takes me 20 minutes to just be able to do enough damage to kill them, if I put this on the hardest difficulty, they'd probably kill me in 1 or 2 hits, and it would take me 40 minutes. But their moveset doesn't change, their patterns don't change, I've just got to make sure I'm a little bit more cautious. So again, this doesn't increase the difficulty so much as it just makes you play as God of Caution, which for me, in a game called God of War, I don't want to have to play more cautiously, I'd want to play more smartly. So if they became more aggressive, for instance, but they don't change the damage in a way that actually does make the bosses more challenging, that's something that I would very much enjoy playing, because it would justify itself, because the game changes. It's one of the problems that I had with New Game Plus in Dark Souls 3. When you go into New Game Plus in Dark Souls 2, the enemies, yes, they increase their health, they increase their damage, and you do less damage to them, but the game actually changed. There were more enemies, they changed the placements, enemies got more aggressive. Originally, some bosses even slightly changed some of their movesets and setups. This was very enjoyable. Dark Souls 3, however, did it in a way where the enemies just got tougher and you just got weaker. This serves no purpose because there's no incentive to do it, there's no reason to do it. If you've memorized the boss's movesets and you can do it on New Game without getting hit, doing it in New Game Plus without getting hit just means you have to do the same but for longer. This isn't a good way to increase difficulty. I wish games would stop trying to do this to increase difficulty, because it doesn't make the game more enjoyable and more challenging, it just makes the game more tedious. So let's talk about the story. The story in this game was very enjoyable. I very much enjoyed the journey of Kratos and his son. As someone who's recently become a father themselves over the last 9 months, for me this was very enjoyable. I could relate to this, and I'm someone who's never related to a game. I'm not one of those people who believed in identity politics when it comes to game. I've never looked at a game going, oh, I need to see myself in the protagonist. However, this was one of the first times I have done this. The relationship that he had with his son was quite touching. The whole journey of trying to bury the mother, well, spread her ashes, for me that hit home quite hard. That was something that was very sweet. However, the biggest problem I had with the story is the whole way through you're told about all the epic activities of the gods. You find the murals of the gods, you get told all the stories of mythos, the massive battles that Thor had, Ragnarok, all the history about Odin, hyping up Tyr, how he's not actually dead but he might be, he's just trapped somewhere. The game really sets up a lot of things. So the game sets up all these threads, and you're thinking, this has to pay off at some point. The first act of the game is obviously the initial teaching of the boy. The second act of the game, he has a little heel turn, and it's about trying to bring him back to dealing with the fact that he is a god, and not to let that ego go to his head. Again, this is a very good character arc, and very enjoyable, and it completes at the end of what feels like the second act, when you spread the mother's ashes. And then the game ends. The game ends, and it feels like you should be starting the third act. There are 3 realms you haven't explored. You killed the first antagonist from the first boss battle finally, and it was a nice closure to the opening of the game, leaving the fact that he was never really after you with. The whole purpose of the story was, you believed that he was after you because you were the ghost of Sparta, but it's revealed that it was actually because he was looking for a giant who he has assumed was you, not your dead wife. Because of this, the whole game has been set up that you've been hounded by the gods, well, one of them in particular, and he was sent after you by another god. So you're thinking, okay, I've got the peon out of the way, I've killed the tracker, now I can start taking on the lieutenants, now I can go for the general, now I can take down the gods that have been hounding me, but were actually after my wife. But no, the game ends. You get a nice little scene where you finally get set up for that epic battle at the end of the game where Thor turns up, lightning's going, everything is hyped, everything is pumped, you have all your legendary gear, you'd already killed all the side quests and the Valkyries. Hell, I did that before I got to the end of the game, thinking that freeing the dragons and freeing the Valkyries would play some part of fighting Odin. And as someone who doesn't like to miss anything, because this game does sometimes take you to areas that you can never go back to, so if you miss a chest, that item or gear set is gone, you'll never get back to that. So I made sure to do everything as early as possible, and as much as that made it the game harder, I felt like I had to do it as a completionist because I didn't want to miss a secret ending. But that never happens. You never get that. You never go to Asgard, you never go to the final 3 realms, you never fight any real major gods. Yes, Baldur is the brother of Thor, but in Norse mythology he's not exactly an impressive person. He was a bit of a mama's boy. Even if you've played Being Human, so you actually know who Baldur is, not many people would know him as a god because he's not exactly someone who's mainstream, you're going to be left feeling disappointed. Yes, they had some very good fights with him, and the ending was kind of cinematic, but everything felt watered down and neutered. This is the biggest problem I had with the story, is the game never once felt like God of War. It felt like Dad of Boy, Dad of War, I don't know, God of Cheese at the most. Hell, I'm pretty sure Kratos takes soy in his lattes these days. There was no point where you felt like Kratos, the brutal ghost of Sparta on his vengeance to hatred of the gods. And at the start of the game, it feels right, because he's teaching his son, he's trying to protect him, but even in those scenes where his son's in danger, he never gives back into that rage. You can, yes, argue that maybe Kratos has developed and grown, but you don't have the amazing scenes. There are appropriate times where you'd think you would see Kratos lose control. Show that rage, show what made him the God of War. But we never get there. The whole game is very watered down and PG-13. There was none of these big executions. I think one of the most savage parts of the game is you stab one enemy in the eyes. Compare this to, say, Helios, where you are ripping off his head, or even Poseidon, where you pummel him into the ground, or, say, impaling people into walls. There were so many amazing deaths in the original God of War games that were just so brutal and memorable, that the new God of War 2018 never once has one of these scenes. The whole story feels like it's the development of your son, and when you complete that, you then don't get the conclusion. Obviously they've set this up for the sequel of the game, there's no DLC planned is what they've reported, but again, this fills me with feelings of disappointment. I feel like the whole game has hyped me up for something that it then just never delivers. The fact that the game feels like a giant commercial for a next more interesting game kind of annoys me, because yes, the world is beautiful, yes, the world was really well connected, the gameplay was amazing, yes, everything was set up really nice, there weren't any memorable bosses, the story was very beautiful, but the ending was a blue ball and tease. You never really complete the story, and you know it's because they wanted to cash in for a second game, which I, honestly, as someone who's bought the game, I feel like that's kind of a letdown. Because there's no multiplayer in the game, there's no reason for me to go through it. Later, there's no New Game Plus, so I can't exactly use what I've gathered so far to then take on a harder difficulty. You can change the difficulty at any point in the game, so it's not like you could be going on the hardest difficulty, find a challenge, and then you'd be like, well, maybe I need to play through the game on an easier difficulty. You can just change at any point, complete this hard challenge, and then ramp the difficulty back up again. Again, this means that I don't really have a reason to go for a second play. Hell, I'm considering trading the game in just to get my money back whilst it's still the hot sell, so that way I can maybe get another game. Hell, I might even try Far Cry 5 because it might last me longer than just the weekend. And unfortunately, this is one of those opinions that's going to get me in trouble with the fanboys. You can't seem to give constructive criticism these days because everyone goes based on facts. And not on facts, but on feelings over facts. So when I look at God of War, I think this was a very enjoyable game, but it was more of a letdown at the ending than Mass Effect 3. And I'm someone who didn't exactly hate the ending of Mass Effect 3, but the ending of this did leave me feeling really unfilled. Would I recommend the game? Absolutely, but not as a full price purchase. I would say wait until the game drops down to half price. It will still be just as enjoyable then, because obviously there's no future content planned at this time. This may change, but there's no reason to pay full price for this game. I would honestly say wait until it's on discount, so that way you can experience the same game that everyone else did, but without having to spend as much money, because in the end, to truly get the God of War experience that you were promised, you're going to need to buy God of War 5 whenever they release that, and you're not getting that experience in this God of War. So yep, it's a good setup, it's a good premise for a new trilogy, but it's very obvious that that's what they were planning, and that was a new franchise, and I can never justify spending £60 or $80 to play this setup or a prologue demo for a much bigger series. Wait a few years, get the whole 3 Master Collection, and that way you'll get the true God of War experience. However, that's my opinion, and this is Revan619 out.